The year was 1887, and the silence of the high plains was a living thing. It pressed in on the walls of Isaac Blackwood's cabin, seeped through the chinking, and settled in the hollows of his heart. For 5 years, this silence had been his only constant companion, a presence more real than the ghost of his wife's laughter or the imagined cry of his infant son. His ranch was a lonely island in a sea of grass and sky, a spread of land so vast and unforgiving it seemed to have swallowed all sound, all hope, all memory of a life that had once held meaning. The wind, a ceaseless mourner, keened around the eaves, its voice the only one that ever answered the questions he no longer dared to ask. Isaac's life had been pared down to the bone, a stark routine of survival that left little room for thought and even less for feeling. He rose before the sun painted the eastern horizon in bruised shades of purple and rose, his movements stiff from the cold and the deeper chill of solitude. He tended his small herd of cattle, their placid chewing a rhythmic counterpoint to the howling wind. He mended fences that seemed to sag under the weight of sheer emptiness, their wires humming a desolate tune. His hands, calloused and scarred, were tools that performed tasks without direction from his mind, which remained a fallow field where grief had long ago choked out everything else. Inside the cabin, the past was preserved like a fly in amber. On the mantelpiece, a small, crudely carved rocking horse sat motionless, its runners never having known the joyful push of a child's hand. In a basket near the cold hearth lay a half-finished piece of knitting, the wooden needles still tangled in the yarn, exactly as his Clara had left them the day the fever came. He never touched these things, yet he could never bring himself to put them away. They were monuments to a loss, so profound it had become the very architecture of his soul. He was a man living in a museum of his own making, the sole, silent curator of a life that had ended long ago. His trips to the nearest town, a dusty collection of clapboard buildings named Prairie's End, were rare and purely functional. He endured the stares of the townsfolk, some filled with pity, others with a grim judgment, as if his tragedy were a contagion they feared. He would trade his hides, buy his flour and salt, and retreat back to his isolation before the weight of their hesitant greetings could press too heavily upon him. He had become a creature of the wilderness, more comfortable with the company of coyotes than of men. His stasis was complete, a quiet, unending winter of the spirit from which he believed there was no spring. It was on one such reluctant journey, with the late autumn sun casting long skeletal shadows across the plains, that the ice around his heart first began to crack. He had finished his business at the general store and was about to mount his horse when a commotion from the center of the dusty street drew his attention. A small crowd had gathered around a makeshift platform, and standing atop it was a man Isaac knew by reputation only, a callous opportunist named Callahan, who profited from the misfortunes of others. Callahan was hawking what he called unclaimed assets from a wagon train that had met with disaster somewhere east of the territory. Isaac saw a broken clock, a set of tarnished silverware, and then, with a jolt that ran through him like a physical blow, he saw the woman. She was standing on a wooden crate, her posture rigid, her hands bound loosely in front of her. Most cruelly, a rough burlap sack, the kind used for potatoes or grain, was pulled down over her head and tied at the neck with a piece of twine. "Strong back, good for chores," Callahan bellowed, his voice grating. "Quiet, too. Won't give you no trouble. The sack is to keep her from being difficult, but you can take it off once you get her home. Who'll start the bidding? I'm asking a mere $2. $2 for a lifetime of hard work." A few men in the crowd snickered, their eyes filled with a predatory gleam. The women on the periphery looked on with a mixture of horror and fascination, whispering behind their hands. Isaac felt a surge of sickness rise in his gorge. It was the ugliest thing he had ever seen, a raw display of human cruelty that made the harshness of the land seem gentle by comparison. His first instinct was to turn away, to ride back to his silent sanctuary and forget this degradation, but his feet remained planted in the dust. He looked at the still, shrouded figure on the crate, a person reduced to an object, her humanity stolen and replaced with a price tag. He saw not just a woman, but the embodiment of every cruel turn of fate, every loss, every injustice the world could inflict. An impulse, foreign and powerful, seized him. It was a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who had believed in right and wrong, the man Clara had loved. Before he was fully aware of his own actions, he was striding forward. The crowd parted before him. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around 2 heavy silver dollars. He did not hand them to Callahan. He threw them into the dust at the man's feet. They landed with a soft thud, the sound swallowed by a sudden, shocked silence. "She's mine," Isaac said, his voice a low growl he barely recognized as his own. He had not intended to speak, had not known what he would do until it was done. He had just bought a human being, and in doing so, he had shattered the frozen stillness of his own existence forever. The ride back to the ranch was a long, suffocating stretch of silence. The woman, her head still encased in the rough burlap, followed a few paces behind his horse, her steps small and even in the dust. Isaac did not look back. The 2 silver dollars felt like searing brands on his conscience. He had acted not out of a desire for a servant, but from a place of raw, protective anger. Yet the result was the same. He was now a master, and she was, what? His property? The thought was vile. The wind picked up, howling across the prairie, but for the first time in years, it could not drown out the turmoil in his own mind. He was a man adrift, having cast himself from the desolate shore he knew into an unknown and treacherous sea. When they reached the cabin, the familiar sight of its weathered logs and stone chimney offered no comfort. It felt alien, a stage for a play he did not know how to act in. He dismounted and, without a word, gestured for her to enter. She hesitated for a fraction of a second at the threshold before stepping inside, a small, anonymous shape swallowed by the shadows of his home. He followed, the space suddenly feeling cramped and crowded. His sanctuary of grief had been invaded. His carefully curated silence was now occupied by another breathing, living soul. He lit a lamp, the yellow light flickering over the room's meager furnishings. He watched her as she stood by the door, as still and silent as the rocking horse on the mantel. He felt a profound and unnerving awkwardness. What were the words for a situation like this? There were none. He moved to the stove and ladled a portion of the stew he'd made that morning into a bowl. He set it on the small table. "You should eat," he said. The words were functional, scraped clean of any emotion. She moved to the table and sat, her movements economical and precise. To his astonishment, she did not remove the sack. She tilted her head, somehow finding the opening of the bag and lifting the rim of the bowl to it, eating with a mechanical slowness that was unnerving to watch. The absurdity of the senior-shrouded figure consuming a meal in his quiet cabin was stark and unsettling. When she was finished, she placed the bowl back on the table with a soft click. "The cot in the corner is yours," he told her, his voice rough. He pointed toward the narrow bed where he had spent countless restless nights. "You can sleep there." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He felt a sudden, desperate need for air, for the familiar emptiness of the plains. He stepped outside into the biting wind, leaving her in the lamplit quiet. He would sleep by the hearth tonight, the old rifle near at hand. Not because he truly feared Hershey seemed as fragile as a bird, but because the world had been turned on its head, and he no longer knew its rules. The solid ground of his grief had given way, and he was falling. The days that followed unfolded in a strange, silent rhythm. The woman, whom he thought of only as the woman, rose with him at dawn. She did not speak, and he did not press her to. The sack remained on her head, a constant, unnerving barrier between them. She was an absence and a presence all at once, a ghost who performed the tasks of the living. She found the mending basket, Clara's basket, and began to repair his worn shirts with tiny, meticulous stitches that put his own clumsy efforts to shame. She swept the floor, her movements creating a soft, rhythmic shushing that was the first new sound in the cabin in 5 years. She worked in the small, neglected garden behind the cabin, her bound hands surprisingly deft as she pulled weeds and turned the soil around the withered stems of last season's vegetables. Isaac watched her from a distance, a knot of confusion tightening in his chest. He had brought her to save her from one degradation, only to subject her to another in his own home. He was her keeper. The thought was a constant, low-grade fever in his blood. They shared meals in the same tense silence, the space between them at the small table charged with unspoken questions, with fear, with a profound and mutual uncertainty. One evening, after a week of this suffocating pantomime, something in Isaac finally broke. The sight of her sitting by the fire, her facelessness, a silent accusation, became more than he could bear. The sack was not just a piece of burlap, it was a symbol of her subjugation, of his complicity. His frustration, born of shame and helplessness, boiled over. "Take it off," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. She flinched, her whole body going rigid. She did not move. "Take the sack off your head," he repeated, standing up. He walked toward her, his shadow falling over her small form. "I did not pay for a ghost in a bag. I want to see who I am sharing my home with." He saw her hands tremble where they rested in her lap. For a long moment, he thought she would refuse. The silence stretched, thin and taut. Then, with an agonizing slowness, her hands rose. Her fingers fumbled with the twine at her neck. The knot came loose. She gripped the bottom of the coarse fabric and, with a final, shuddering breath, lifted the sack over her head. The firelight fell upon her face. Isaac's breath caught in his throat. His mind reeled, unable to process what his eyes were seeing. It was a face he knew, yet did not know. It was thinner, etched with lines of hardship, and a sorrow so deep it seemed to have taken up permanent residence in her eyes. But the shape of her face, the curve of her jaw, the startling blue of her irises, they were an echo, a reflection of a memory so sacred and painful, it was like a knife to his heart. It was not Clara, but it was the ghost of her. He stumbled back a step, a low sound escaping his lips. He knew her. He had seen this face only once before, on the happiest day of his life. She had been a young girl then, standing beside her older sister at a wedding ceremony, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. Esther? The name was a whisper, a ghost on his tongue. The woman Esther looked up at him, her own eyes wide with a dawning, disbelieving recognition. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She gave a small, broken nod. The strength went out of Isaac's legs. The floorboards seemed to rush up to meet him as he dropped to his knees. The sound of his impact echoed the collapse of the world he had built around himself. It was not just shock that brought him down. It was a tidal wave of every emotion he had suppressed for 5 years. Grief, love, regret, and a shame so profound it burned him from the inside out. He had stood in the dust of Prairie's End and bought his dead wife's sister like an animal at auction. The cabin, once a tomb of silence, was now filled with the sound of Isaac's ragged breathing. He remained on his knees, the rough-hewn floorboards pressing into his flesh, unable to look away from the face that was both a painful memory and a shocking, unbelievable reality. Esther sat just as still, the burlap sack lying in a heap on the floor beside her, a shed skin of her anonymity. In her eyes, he saw not only her own terror and exhaustion, but a reflection of his wife, a ghost of Clara, looking back at him through the years. "It is you," he finally managed to say, his voice raw. I couldn't know." "Isaac," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. The sound of his own name, spoken by her, was a strange and intimate thing. "I thought you were dead too." Slowly, painfully, the story came out. She spoke in fragments at first, her words hesitant, as if she were afraid they would crumble into dust. Her family, Clara's parents, her younger brother, had set out from Ohio the previous spring, chasing the same dream of a new life that had once drawn him and Clara west. But the trail was cruel. Fever had swept through their wagon train, the same relentless sickness that had stolen his own family. She was the only one who had survived, found wandering by men who saw not a grieving orphan, but an opportunity. Callahan had been the worst of them. As he listened, the shame that had brought him to his knees began to transform into something else. It was a white-hot anger at Callahan, at the world for its casual cruelty, and at himself for his years of passive mourning. Beneath that anger, something fragile and unfamiliar began to stir, a sense of purpose. This was not a stranger he had rescued out of a moment of pity. This was family. This was Esther, Clara's sister. A living link to the life he had lost, a person he was now bound to protect, not by a $2 transaction, but by the sacred memory of the woman they had both loved. He rose to his feet, his movements deliberate. He went to the basin and filled it with fresh water from the bucket. He brought it to her, along with a clean cloth. He knelt before her again, not in shock this time, but in a gesture of service. "Here," he said softly. He gently took the cloth and dipped it in the water, his large, calloused hands surprisingly steady. With infinite care, he began to wash the grime from her face, his touch as reverent as if he were tending to a holy relic. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the simple human kindness of the act. The transaction in the dusty street was being washed away, replaced by something new and unspoken. That night, the entire dynamic of the cabin shifted. "You will take the bed," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It was her sister's bed once. It is yours now." He moved his own few belongings to the small cot in the corner without another word. He was no longer her keeper, he was her guardian. In the days that followed, a fragile truce with the silence was forged. They began to speak, their conversations tentative at first, circling the great, dark void of their shared loss. They spoke of Clara. Esther shared stories from their childhood, painting a picture of the girl Isaac had never known, one who climbed trees and had a laugh like wind chimes. Isaac, in turn, spoke of their brief, happy years together on this very land, of her hopes for the child she carried, of the way she had loved the vast, open sky. With every shared memory, they were weaving a thread between their two solitudes, creating a tapestry of remembrance that was both heartbreaking and healing. He saw how the fear in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a deep, weary sadness, and then, occasionally, by a flicker of something else. Something like peace. He taught her to shoot the old rifle, not as a command, but as a lesson in self-reliance. Her hands, once bound, learned to hold the weapon with a steady confidence. She, in turn, brought a semblance of life back into the cabin. She found a small tin of Clara's seeds and planted a new garden, her determination a quiet act of defiance against the barrenness of the land and their lives. They worked alongside each other, the shared labor, a language more eloquent than words. A new equilibrium was being established, a delicate balance of grief and nascent hope. But the world beyond their isolated haven had not forgotten them. The ugliness of Prairie's End had a long reach. One afternoon, as Isaac was chopping wood, he saw a plume of dust on the horizon. It was not the familiar small cloud of a lone rider. It was 3 horses, moving with an aggressive speed. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his blood, who it was. He strode back to the cabin, his hand resting on the axe handle. "Esther," he said, his voice low and urgent, "go inside, bar the door, do not open it for anyone but me." She looked from his face to the approaching riders, and the fear he had worked so hard to banish returned to her eyes, stark and raw. She nodded, her face pale, and slipped back inside. The heavy wooden bar slid into place with a solid thud. Isaac stood his ground in front of the cabin, the axe held loosely at his side. He watched as Callahan and 2 of his thuggish associates reined in their horses, kicking up a cloud of dirt that settled over him like a shroud. Callahan's face was a mask of smug arrogance. "Blackwood," he sneered, dismounting. "I heard a funny thing in town. Heard you were treating my property like she's some kind of lady, setting her up in your own house." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Isaac's feet. "That wasn't part of our deal. The $2 was for a servant. If you want to play house with her, the price has gone up, considerably. Isaac's grip tightened on the axe handle. The rage he felt was a clean, cold fire. This man was not just a bully and a thief, he was a desecrator. He had put a price on Esther's head, and now he was trying to put a price on her soul. "She is not your property," Isaac said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The deal is done. You took the money. Now leave my land." Callahan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your land? This is a big country, old man. I reckon I'll leave when I'm good and ready. Either you pay me another $50, or I'm taking the girl back. I'm sure I can find another buyer who'll appreciate her proper." He took a step forward, his cronies fanning out behind him. The moment was stretched taut, the air humming with imminent violence. This was not just a confrontation over money or a woman. It was a battle for the small patch of hope that had begun to grow in the wasteland of Isaac's life. It was a test. For 5 years, he had been a man running from a ghost. Now, he had to become a man who could stand and fight for the living. The numbness was gone, burned away by a fierce, protective fire he had forgotten he possessed. Isaac did not waver. He stood before the cabin door like a man carved from the rock of the mountains themselves, a solitary guardian against the encroaching darkness. Callahan took another swaggering step forward, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He saw only a grieving widower, a man worn down by solitude and time. He did not see the transformation that had taken place in the heart of that quiet man. "I'm not asking again, Blackwood," Callahan snarled, gesturing to one of his men. "Get the girl." As the man moved toward the cabin, Isaac acted. He did not raise the axe to threaten. He simply shifted his weight, his body coiling with a purpose that was swift and absolute. "I said, leave my land." His voice was no longer quiet. It was a command, resonant with an authority that stunned Callahan into a moment's hesitation. It was all the time Isaac needed. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't use the axe blade. He used the heavy handle, swinging it in a short, brutal arc that caught Callahan's approaching henchman square in the gut. The man doubled over with a grunt, the air exploding from his lungs. The second man, seeing his companion fall, drew a knife and lunged. Isaac was no brawler, but years of hard labor had given him a strength as tough and unyielding as seasoned oak. He sidestepped the clumsy thrust, his free hand clamping down on the man's wrist with crushing force. He twisted, using the man's own momentum against him, and sent him sprawling into the dust. The knife clattered harmlessly away. Now it was just him and Callahan. The man's smugness had evaporated, replaced by a look of disbelief and fury. He was bigger than Isaac, heavier, but he was soft with vice and easy living. Isaac was hard, honed by grief and labor into something essential and dangerous. Callahan roared and charged, his fists swinging like clumsy mallets. Isaac met the charge not with brute force, but with a cold precision. He ducked under a wild punch, driving his shoulder hard into Callahan's midsection. They crashed to the ground together, a tangle of limbs and fury. Dust flew, obscuring the struggle. For a moment, all that could be heard was the grunting strain of 2 men locked in a primal conflict. From inside the cabin came a single, terrified cry of his name. "Isaac." Esther's voice was the spark that ignited the last of his reserves. He was no longer fighting for land or pride. He was fighting for her right to be safe, to be free, to heal. He was fighting for the memory of Clara and for the future he hadn't known he wanted until this very moment. With a surge of strength that surprised even himself, he rolled on top of Callahan, his hands finding the man's throat. He did not squeeze. He simply held him there, pinned to the earth, his eyes blazing with a fire that promised utter annihilation. "This is over," Isaac growled, his face inches from Callahan's. "You will get on your horse. You will ride away from here. And if you or your men ever set foot on this land again, if you so much as speak her name in town, I will find you, and I will finish this." There was no doubt in his words. Callahan, his face purple and his bravado shattered, saw not a rancher, but a reaper. He nodded frantically, his eyes wide with terror. Isaac released him and stood up, his chest heaving. He was bruised, his knuckles were bleeding, but he had never felt more whole. He kicked Callahan's rifle away into the tall grass. "Go," he commanded. Scrambling to their feet, Callahan and his men stumbled back to their horses. They mounted with none of their earlier arrogance and spurred their animals into a panicked retreat, not once looking back. Isaac watched them until they were nothing more than a dissolving stain of dust on the horizon. The threat was gone. The silence that returned was not empty. It was earned. It was the sound of peace. Slowly, he turned and walked back to the cabin. The bar slid back with a scraping sound, and the door opened. Esther stood there, her face streaked with tears, the old rifle clutched in her hands. She had been ready to use it. She looked at his battered face, his bleeding hands, and then her eyes met his. In that single shared glance, everything was said. The last of the shadows between them, the specter of the transaction, the ghost of her subjugation, vanished in the harsh light of the afternoon sun. He had not just bought her freedom for $2. He had just now, with his own body and will, truly earned it for her. In the quiet hours that followed the fight, a new domesticity settled over the cabin. Esther insisted on tending to his wounds. She bathed the scrapes on his face and wrapped his bruised knuckles with strips of clean linen, her touch gentle and sure. They moved around each other in the small space with an unspoken understanding, the air thick with relief and a profound, wordless intimacy. The violence had been an exorcism, purging the last of the cabin's ghosts and sanctifying it as their shared refuge. With the external threat gone, the life they began to build took on a sturdier shape. The rhythm of their days was no longer defined by caution, but by a quiet collaboration. They worked together to repair the fence Callahan's men had trampled, the shared task a symbol of their efforts to secure their small world. He taught her the names of the constellations in the vast, dark sky, pointing them out with the same hand she had bandaged. She, in turn, discovered a small crate of his wife's books and began to read aloud to him in the evenings by the fire, her voice filling the cabin with stories that were not their own, allowing them a temporary escape into other worlds. Laughter, a sound Isaac thought had been permanently exiled from his life, began to return. It started as a small, quiet thing, a shared smile over a clumsy mishap, a soft chuckle at a line in a book. But it grew, slowly and steadily, like the seeds in Esther's garden. The cabin, once a monument to what was lost, was transforming into a testament to what had been found. It was becoming a home, not by virtue of its walls and roof, but because of the two souls who now inhabited it, each healing the other with their presence. One evening, months later, as the first hints of spring were softening the hard edges of the land, Isaac sat on the porch, carving a piece of cottonwood. He was not carving another memorial to the past. He was shaping a small, intricate bird, its wings poised for flight. Esther came out and sat on the steps beside him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cool evening air. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sun bleed across the horizon in strokes of orange and gold. "Esther," he said, his voice soft, his eyes on the endless plains before them. "The winter is over. The trails will be clear soon. You are free to go wherever you wish. If there is a place you want to be, I will take you there. I will give you whatever you need to start again." He was offering her the one thing she had been denied for so long, a choice. He was releasing her from any sense of obligation, from the debt of the $2 silver and the debt of his protection. She was silent for a moment, and he felt a pang of fear, a cold premonition of the silence returning to his life. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, not daring to look at her. Then she spoke, her voice clear and steady in the twilight. "I have been on a long journey, Isaac. I have been running from memories, and I have been herded like cattle. I have seen enough of the world out there to last a lifetime." She shifted, and he felt her gaze on him. He finally turned to meet her eyes. In their blue depths, he saw no restlessness, no desire for distant horizons. He saw a quiet strength, a deep-seated peace, and something that made his own weary heart ache with a sweet and hopeful pain. All that time, she continued, a small, gentle smile touching her lips, I was just trying to find my way home. She looked away from him then, her gaze sweeping over the sturdy cabin, the newly tilled garden, the vast and beautiful land that had once seemed so threatening. Her eyes came to rest back on his face. I think I am already there. A profound stillness settled between them. The wind whispered through the new leaves of the cottonwood tree, a sound not of mourning but of life. Isaac looked down at the finished bird in his hands, its wooden form smooth and perfect. He had started a new life without even realizing it. He held it out to her, an offering. She took it, her fingers brushing against his, and in that simple touch, a promise was made. A promise of a shared future, of a home built not on a patch of dirt, but in the shelter of each other's care. Here, on the edge of the world, two broken people had found not just survival, but redemption, and a love as quiet and as powerful as the land itself.